Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
Here you see a later medieval depiction with sages, i.e. the clerics with their mitres, and warrior aristocracies at the top. Then we have merchants coming into history. Of course, they've always been there, but they have higher status now in the 15th century, and workers on the right. And we find these occupational schemes in a lot of societies, China and Japan, and the Middle East, as well as in Europe. Now, of course, since that time, societies have become much more integrated. These castes, these orders have bifurcated. But I would argue that this framework, used flexibly, can help us to see which forces are really operating in society and in history. So what are these castes, briefly? Well, for a long time, the most important one were the warrior aristocrats. Warriors were linked up with aristocracies, with the landed aristocracies. So the warrior values of heroism, militarism, were mixed with landowner ideas of paternalism and hierarchy. In the modern world, it has declined everywhere, not only the aristocracy, but also its values of hierarchy, empire. All of these values have declined everywhere, but we still see those values in many societies. We see the remnants actually in Britain, for instance, if we think of the royal family. These are still big landowners, they dress up in military uniforms, they fly the latest version of the medieval warhorse, the helicopter, in far-flung outposts like Afghanistan. You know, this is still a recognisably warrior aristocratic caste. Of course, it doesn't have very much power anymore in Britain. It has more power or different versions of it have more power, say, among the strong men of the Middle East or Russia. Merchants, in contrast, have become much more powerful. They can be found in parts, though not all parts of the business world. We're most likely to find merchants, flexible merchants, in trade and finance, i.e. banks. Merchants are middlemen, are traders, and we're most likely to find their value systems in trading and financial areas. They value competition, flexibility, networking. They often value toleration. They want to trade with anybody, whatever their culture. But capitalists can also be more sagely. For instance, industrialists or capitalists in other sectors. So not all capitalists are merchants. If you move on to sages, sages value expertise and ideas. They began as holy people, but then they bifurcated into clerics and clerks, that is, priests and bureaucrats. And since the 60s in the West, they've bifurcated yet again between more technocratic managers and the people I call creatives. That is, often university-educated professionals who have more autonomy at work and are much more likely, as sociologists tell us, to value 1960s values of cultural liberalism, self-expression, i.e. the classic Guardian reader, Lib Dem voter. Workers have been less powerful than the other three, and in the modern age, they have asserted themselves in politics, particularly from the late 19th century up until the 70s in the West. They've tended to value equality, understandably, because they don't do well in markets, and they've often been collectivists. They've often valued collective organisation. So, all of these groups struggle for power, or they make alliances with each other. And political orders are usually made up of particular caste alliances. So, within societies, we see differences between castes. Academics are likely to be more market sceptical than bankers. But at the same time, one caste can achieve a sort of ideological hegemony and shift the whole political spectrum in their direction. And that, I think, is what's been happening in the 1980s. And in history, we see lots of these major power shifts, caste power shifts, from one caste set of values to another. And that is what I'm going to be tracing now in history itself. Now, the warrior aristocrat has been under attack for a long time, and one can think of the Enlightenment, you can think of French Revolution. the rising merchant, sagely, and worker castes all attacked the aristocrat. The British aristocracy dealt with the problem, in crude terms, partly by incorporating merchants, much more so than other aristocracies in the world. And it was this combination of aristocracy and merchants which was the basis of the British success in the 18th and 19th centuries. But even in Britain, we forget how powerful and important those aristocracies were. This is George V and Kaiser Wilhelm, classic warrior aristocratic poses before World War I. Now, after the war, various castes tried to take the place of the aristocracy. Communist revolutions, the workers, there were nationalist revolutions against empires in India, China, in Egypt, made up various caste alliances. But actually, it wasn't the worker or the technocrat, the sage, who won out, it was the merchant. And I argue in the book that we should see the 20s as an era when the merchant tried to rule the world alone. 20s isn't normally seen like this, but this was the era when the United States, which was the most influential world power, was taking over from Britain, and this was a state which was very much influenced by merchant values. Laissez-faire Republican presidents, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, were convinced that the world's problems could be solved not by state action or by military involvement, but through merchant approaches, and especially by private banks. And this was the beginning of the role of the International Investment Bank, JP Morgan. This is when they came into their own. The 20s revealed major problems with the merchant approach. Merchants believe in the justice of market reward. They dislike redistribution, they think it encourages laziness, and they think that laziness and poor incentives. But the problem is that lightly regulated markets concentrate wealth in the hands of a few and give few incentives to invest in long-term projects that might provide jobs. It's much more profitable to invest in finance and speculation than it is in long-term industrial development, much less risky. And that leaves the merchant with a problem. Who is going to buy their goods? If ordinary wages are stagnating, who is going to buy their goods? And the merchant solution isn't redistribution or long-term investment, it is that the rich lend money to the poor. They lend money. Banks lend money to keep consumption going. And that's what happened in the 20s United States. This was the early years of consumer credit. And of course, we see very similar things have happened recently. The problem is that this can only go on for so long. Debt bubbles burst, and that's 29 was very similar, really, to 2008 in many ways, except on a larger scale. Now, this is the sort of economic crisis that brings social tensions, because different castes argue over who is to blame. Is it the lenders? Is it the borrowers? And if it's the borrowers, is it governments? Or is it people who lent? Or is it the people who didn't necessarily agree to the borrowing of governments? The other problem is that the merchant tries to solve this problem by saying all the other castes just need to work harder, they need to be more like merchants, they need to pay down their debt, they need to work harder, be more disciplined, i.e. austerity. And it's precisely this sort of solution that it makes the problem worse, and it's this sort of solution that leads to social conflicts, and I would say pretty directly to the rise of warriors like Hitler. And at a time of crisis, what we see at the end of the 20s is a major reaction against the merchant among all groups. They blame them for the crisis. So here we have a Soviet poster, the evil capitalist and capitalism collapsing under the October hurricane, i.e. the 1929. Here we have Roosevelt casting out the money changers from the temple. Here we have the Nazi equivalent of the merchant as the Jew. The response is, the merchant has failed us, we're in this crisis, we look to the warrior. And that happened on both left and right. Stalinism and Nazism were forms of warriorism, different forms of warriorism, and the conflict that produced brought mass slaughter. And after the war, Western elites were determined to constrain the warrior. But they also remembered the 20s. They didn't want to go back to the merchant. So the solution was a technocratic compromise. And what this saw was a technocratic worker sort of merchant alliance, brought sagely long-termism, and worker equality. And it was very successful for a time, for some 20, 30 years. Saw the greatest growth ever and quite a lot of equality. But it had its flaws, as I'm sure we all remember. It didn't cope with economic shifts well. And also, importantly, while it was economically equal, it was quite culturally hierarchical on questions like race, gender, sexuality, and it alienated a new rising caste of creative sages, a sort of higher educated group who had autonomous professional jobs, took autonomy seriously. And most of us remember when that caste order collapsed in the 70s. Again, in the 80s, we saw a sharp backlash, a return to the merchant values, very much of the 20s America. And that was partly because the merchants had a new ally, the creative caste. They were not collectivists, they didn't like the technocratic sage, they liked the individualism. And they particularly liked this new version of the merchant, what I call the soft merchant. We saw sort of two versions of merchants. In 1980s, we saw the harder version. That is, when things are bad, when merchants have to come into conflict with other castes, workers, they tend to show their harder face. They're more intent on imposing merchant values on other castes. But in the 90s and 2000s, we had the soft merchant, i.e. the more tolerant one. Things were going well. They were more welfarist, they were more happy to spend money on welfare, more happy to do deals with other castes, particularly with workers, and they were more culturally liberal, i.e. this is classic, the Blair, Clinton era, the third way era. Okay, this I think gives you a very good example. Okay, this is the Committee to Save the World, i.e. the world from the Asian crisis of 97, Russian crisis of 98. And here we have Robert Rubin, Alan Greenspan, and Larry Summers. Now, in a way, Alan Greenspan is a classic hard merchant figure, a figure of the 80s, 70s and 80s, Ayn Rand type person. And here we have the Clintonians, Rubin and Summers, and they believe in welfare spending. So there are conflicts between them. But basically, it's the soft merchants who are willing to have welfare, who are predominant in the 90s and 2000s. And the soft merchants were in control because things seemed to be going well, the money was there. But of course, under the surface, there's quite a lot of discontent, I think. There are losers from this, generally workers, unskilled people, less skilled people. They increasingly felt that the liberal, creative merchant elite was abandoning them, and they moved to a more nationalist right. And interestingly, and we've seen that in the West, with people working classes moving towards a more nationalist right. And also, often they were willing to ally with hard merchants because they agreed with them more on issues of multiculturalism, globalization, than they did with the soft merchants, who they thought were betraying them and giving jobs to foreigners. And I think all of these tensions have been bubbling under the surface for the 90s and 2000s, but they really came out with the crisis of 2008. In a way, 2008 has exacerbated those tensions. And so we see much more, a move towards much more nationalist politics, I think we can expect. In China, for instance, we've seen a poor urban working class, not working class, but urban poor. They're the people behind these nationalist demonstrations, not the middle classes, generally. Where are we likely to go from here? Well, firstly, I think that the history suggests, particularly the history of the 20s, if we think of history in this way and we think of what's happened in the 90s and 2000s, we can't go back to the 90s and 2000s. It was based on credit, on debt. It was a system which is unsustainable, and I think that's the problem that our elites have, that they can't really think out of the box yet. They still think somehow we can go back to that era. I think that's not possible. What's been happening is that banks have been flooding the economy with money, with cash to keep the system going. Unlike the 30s, of course. They've learned that lesson from the 30s. But really, they haven't been doing anything structural. They've just been keeping the system going by putting more and more cash into the economy, QE, Ben Bernanke's QE, and Bank of England's QE, quantitative easing. So that's unsustainable. And I think the fundamental problem we face is that to be successful, capitalism needs a lot of collaboration between castes. High-tech industries require long-term investment in technology and training, and that requires quite a lot of social intervention, state intervention, perhaps, or collaboration at least, even if it's not state intervention. It also requires compromises between management and labour. And I think this compromise explains why Germany is so much more successful than some other economies, like Britain's or the United States at the moment. So we need collaboration. We also need international collaboration to deal with issues like the global financial imbalances, particularly between the United States and China. But within countries, the current merchant and creative sage value systems, which are so dominant, are highly individualistic and have little interest in this sort of collectivism or this sort of collaboration. There's little appetite for a return to the 50s and 60s social democracy. And you know, I sort of sympathise with that in some way, but on the other hand, one realises one needs some sort of compromise. And international obstacles to international collaboration are slightly different. To deal with financial imbalances and trade, we need collaboration with China particularly, but China feels it's still fighting the old battles of imperialism, trying to reverse the inequalities brought by imperialism in the aristocratic age. And often the United States can act in the world in a way which makes that seem quite a plausible analysis. So there's very little at the moment enthusiasm in places like China or India or Brazil to make the sorts of compromises. And also the United States wants to remain the great power and is not willing to make those sorts of compromises. So at the moment, I can't be very optimistic about the compromises we need to sustain capitalism. So what is likely to happen? Are we likely to go back to the 30s is the big question. Well, it's not inevitable, and we're not there yet. Of course, there are many differences from the 30s. We have big welfare states. Democratic institutions in Europe are much stronger. In Europe, particularly, there aren't the territorial conflicts, but there are many territorial conflicts in the world. China and Japan is a good example. And also, it may be that as middle classes start to lose their jobs, they may take a more egalitarian attitude. They may be more willing to make those compromises. On the other hand, there are serious worries. How can we survive long-term reduction in living standards? How can a continuing global recession, will that increase trade tensions between China and the US? Now, to finish, I don't want to predict that we're going to be marching down the Mall in torchlight parades. Clearly, we're not going to go back to the 30s in that sense, but my experience of Russia convinces me that we can be worried, and the warrior can return in rather strange forms. And I have a brief example of that, what the warrior might look like in the 2000s. And this is a video, if we can see it, from the 2002 Russian video, which is entitled "Someone Like Putin."
Мой парень снова влип в дурные дела, подрался, наглотался какой-то мути. Он так меня достал, я его прогнала, и я хочу теперь такого, как Путин, такого, как Путин, полного сил, такого, как Путин, чтобы не пил, такого, как Путин, чтоб не обижал, такого, как Путин, чтоб не убежал. Я видела его вчера в новостях. Он говорил о том, что мир на распутье. С таким, как он, легко и дома, и в гостях. И я хочу теперь такого, как Путин. Такого, как Путин, полного сил. Такого, как Путин, чтобы не пил. Такого, как Путин, чтоб не обижал. Такого, как Путин, чтоб не убежал.
Russia, of course, is an extreme example, but who knows what will happen after several years of falling living standards and rising inequality. Many more of us throughout the world might be looking for Takova как Putin, someone like Putin. Thank you.